we can actively seek out psychologically rich experiences, and we can also, I think we can create them in our minds.
What makes us happy? Aristotle proposes a mixture of human flourishing and virtue. But is that really sufficient in our modern world? Is there more we can add to his foundation? Hi, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a newsletter dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks. Today's podcast is with Lorraine Besser, professor of philosophy at Middlebury College, who specializes in the philosophy and psychology of the good life. She was a founding investigator on the research team studying psychological richness and author of many books, including The Art of the Interesting, What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life, and How to Cultivate It, of which we'll be speaking about today. But before we begin, a quick shout out to our wonderful members, the Classical Wisdom community, which make this podcast possible. If you haven't already, please go to classicalwisdom.com to check out our free newsletter and member resources. Now, how can we find psychological richness, both in the everyday and in the extraordinary, to help us achieve the ultimate goal, the good life? Well, I just want to thank you for joining me today to talk about your new book, The Art of the Interesting, What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life and How to Cultivate It, which is a great title. I like The Art of Interesting, immediately grabs the attention. But I want to start off actually with the traditional standpoint, which is probably more of where my listeners and audience are familiar with in the ancient world, which is sort of our shtick. So what do philosophers usually think of when they speak of the good life?
Yeah, thank you. When philosophers usually speak of the good life, we're really thinking about Aristotle. And Aristotle was one of the earliest philosophers to think about the good life, and it's pretty amazing how influential his views have been. And throughout the many years since Aristotle has written, philosophers have done a lot to think about the different aspects in which we might capture this idea of human flourishing. And one interesting that's happened in the past 20, 25 years is the start of psychologists being interested in the good life and the start of psychology researching the good life. It's fascinating that when the very first psychologists started to study the good life, they went to Aristotle for its basis. And psychologists started studying happiness, understood in terms of a hedonistic view of happiness, and they started studying eudaimonia. Over the course of psychological research on eudaimonia, it's come to evolve, it's come to take a step away from Aristotle. Aristotle thought that eudaimonia was all about living this meaningful life, but one that was very dominated by virtue. And psychologists are, when they're studying eudaimonia, they're really thinking more in terms of human flourishing from a psychological perspective. So Aristotle's emphasis on virtue has somewhat dropped out of the picture of certainly interdisciplinary discussions of the good life, and the kind of topic that Aristotle is getting at with human flourishing, right? It's a use of reason in a certain way and striving for purpose and trying to find meaning in your life, and that's really how the two buckets of the good life have been studied, right? In terms of this umbrella concept of meaning, which includes purpose and achievement, and I think virtue. And so that's the kind of umbrella concept of meaning, but also this very separate understanding of happiness, which is pretty narrow and understood really in terms of pleasure.
No, and I think that's so fascinating because we do put a lot of these ancient philosophers on a pedestal. We kind of say like, okay, here's the answer. This is what they said. But the reality is that a lot of times our progress happens when we question them, we challenge them, we add to them. And so that's kind of really critical. And specifically so with Aristotle. I mean, so many fields of his contributions really only started to evolve in like the 18th or 19th century when people started questioning him a little bit more. So I think it's great to start with the foundations. And it is interesting because you think virtue has to be so important, but it's really hard to even define virtue and how to live a virtuous life. I mean, it gets kind of vague or relative. I mean, it becomes difficult. But I think, as you say, there's these sort of two big buckets that kind of make up happiness and human flourishing. But even when people sort of really strive to fulfill those, they're not necessarily happy. We kind of need more. It seems. So what is it that we need? What's the extra contributions that will kind of add to this field of happiness?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think that this is common for many of us that we are trying to structure our lives around happiness and some kind of meaning or a combination of these things. And yet one thing that I think it's important to realize is how much of life gets left out when we focus on those two areas. And so several years ago, a psychologist, Dr. Oshie, contacted me, and he had this hunch that we've been really that philosophers, psychologists have really not noticed an important aspect of people's lives, which are involve these range of experiences that have a particular impact on our minds that we describe in terms of psychological richness. So early on, I was working with Dr. Oshie on these studies. My job as a philosopher was to really carve out how psychologically richness is just different and distinct from happiness and meaning on a theoretical level. And the empirical studies tested that, and we found that it really is a distinct concept.
You're totally right when you're saying it's great that we can add psychology to this and try to be as, I don't know, objective or quantitative as well about these subjects, and kind of bring a whole nother perspective in them. And so psychological richness, sounds great, but what is it? I don't know. How do we get that? How do we become richer psychologically?
Yeah, yeah, it's a new term to wrap our head around. And so psychological richness describes the impact of a particular set of experiences that they have upon our minds. So psychologically rich experiences tend to involve complexity, challenge, and novelty. And what they do when we're experiencing them is that they stimulate us to have new thoughts and to engage our minds in a way that is somewhat free flowing of thoughts and emotions. So the psychological rich descriptor is describing this particular impact where we're facing something and new ideas are cropping up in our mind and we're allowing them to bloom and giving them this space to flow. And oftentimes we'll find that in the course of dealing with, for example, a very complex situation, uh, our minds will crop up and have lots of questions about them and be very curious. I think our minds do strive to answer questions in this way. And what we find is that the new thoughts often stimulate different ranges of emotions, and that all of this stuff often leaves us with a different perspective. And how we find these things, I think there are many, many different ways, and I have a number of different strategies that we can do to enhance these things. I think one really first important step is to recognize where these experiences are in our ordinary lives already. We haven't like created this thing. We're just identifying it and talking about how it is different than happiness and meaning and how it's really valuable and part of the good life. So I think we often have interesting experiences. For example, in reading a book, I think as adults, we really don't read books, outside of the classroom. We're really not reading books that we don't find really interesting and that leave us thinking afterwards. I think often we experience psychological richness and feel the interesting when we are engaging in conversations with somebody new, right? The ones where we just have a conversation, we walk away, and it's impacted on us. It's impacted on our minds, and we're still thinking about it as we walk away. So I think all of us really do already have some familiarity with psychologically rich experiences, and the key is to start to identify them as a valuable set of experiences, be comfortable with what they feel like, and then to allow ourselves to allow those experiences to take a greater role in our lives. So I think there's we can actively seek out psychologically rich experiences, and we can also, I think we can create them in our minds.
Oh, I love that. And I love the dualism of the fact that you can do it both internally and externally. But it's interesting you're saying about like novels. And I feel like that would be a perfect sort of symbol of what you're saying. That if you have a book and you have a character that just does everything right and just lives this, purposefully moral, virtuous life, it gets boring. I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
engage on a whole nother level as do challenges and overcoming things and having these novel experiences and these interactions with new people. And that's usually where the dynamism occurs, like even in literature. So why wouldn't that be true for our own lives?
Of course, yeah. And if you look, I love there's this arc that novels and literature often follows, and that's to make it interesting, right? To develop some complexity that we can engage with that'll influence us and have a particular impact on us. If we're just reading something that doesn't challenge us or doesn't isn't complex, doesn't give us something to dig into, it's going to be a pretty boring experience, and we're going to kind of walk away flat. And I love that you talked about boring, right? So that I do think that boring is the opposite of the interesting. And so, and we're all familiar with the boring, right? We're all familiar with being bored. And so it is worth thinking about, and that is an avenue for many to think about instances that leave them bored and to think about what is distinctive to those experiences. And I think what we'll find when we reflect on our experiences of boredom is that what's unique about them is, or distinctive about boring experiences, is that they don't engage us, right? They don't give our minds anything to latch onto, and they don't stimulate us. So they just really leave us flat. And so I think we can learn a lot from our experiences of boredom, and by also thinking about, instances where we're very much not bored. So if we're trying to wrap our heads around this, right, take your experiences of reading a novel and that you find very boring, and then find the ones that you loved the most. And I can guarantee you that the ones you loved the most have been ones where there is complexity, where we do find these arcs, where they've engaged or tapped into something in you.
Now, I want to kind of refocus on the point of it being sort of relative to both individual, to between individuals, and also within one's own life, because I feel like a lot of people might hear this, okay, I've got to be more interesting, and just think of that Instagram account where their friends traveling everywhere and go, well, they're doing that, but I'm not. But there's ways to do it. I mean, and just like from my own personal experience, I'd say like I am one of those country counters. Like I like to travel very vigorously and force myself to kind of sometimes go to places that I might be like a little bit hesitant, but then I'm like, oh wow, it's completely new and exciting. But I remember during the pandemic, I couldn't go anywhere for months and months. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try to learn Japanese, something like that, it doesn't necessarily have to be one type of experience.
Correct. Absolutely not. What we're looking for are experiences that allow us to, or that stimulate or allow us to engage robustly with them. And yeah, it's almost anything goes here, right? I mean, it's particularly once you are tuned into the feelings of the interesting and you're allowing your mind the space to have interesting experiences. I think we can develop abilities to find almost anything interesting. And yeah, it's really tempting to think that, well, to lead more interesting lives, we have to do more interesting things. And sure, we can, and certainly go for it if that's an option for you. But realistically, that's not an option, to change things in our lives or to start living a completely different life. That's not an option for a lot of us. And that one thing that I think is really important to recognize about this kind of experiences is that we don't have to change the external circumstances of our lives to experience the interesting. You brought up one great example is just like learning something new. And I think, again, as adults, when we go to learn something new, right, we're not trying to necessarily like aim at something or go for a goal or get someplace. We're just trying to have that experience because it's enjoyable for our minds to engage and recognize that that's going to involve like challenge, and it's not always easy to learn something new, and that's part of why I think that many people enjoy it. So there are things that we can do without having to go on trips, without having to leave our house. And I think that the essential point here is that what we're after when we're thinking about psychologically richness and the interesting, what we're after is a particular mental experience, and that's available to us wherever we are. And we might need help stimulating it, certainly. And but I think all of us can look around wherever we are right now and notice something new, and then bring some curiosity to that, and then perhaps that'll start and trigger this robust kind of engagement. So I think, yeah, I talk a lot about how the interesting can fill the spaces in life that happiness and meaning leave behind, right? They're all very important. Happiness and meaning is very important to life. And I'm certainly not advocating that we don't try to have those things in life. But I think that there are these empty spaces, and we'll live valuable lives if we can kind of enhance these empty spaces. So one example I always talk about is like sitting in the waiting room at the dentist or the doctor. This is just wasted time, right? Yet you can, if you have the skills, you can turn even, those 20 minutes into an interesting experience in your mind. And then what you've done is enhanced your experiences yourself. And that I think is like the climax of the art of the interesting. But we can all do it, and some of us need to practice more and make deliberate more efforts. But when we get this art down, we will have that ability to really take those times in life where it just seems like, yeah, there's no happiness happening here, and I'm really not finding anything meaningful right at this moment. Then we can still enhance that area of life when normally I think we just give it up and just count it as, time and stuck in the waiting room.
I love that. I love that, filling the gaps. One tactic I like doing, and this is maybe embarrassing to admit, but like if I'm doing the dishes, and I hate doing the dishes, I think it's just the most boring thing. I know some people just get meditative. I don't. I literally look at the clock and think, okay, this isn't going to take as long as I perceive it to. I mean, it's like torture for me.
Yeah.
So I try to like create haikus in my head about how boring I find doing the dishes. And so at least I kind of create something out of it. I don't know if that's particularly helpful. But I would like to ask for something with regards to, say, routine. Because as you say, there's a lot that people have in their lives that they can't just, go on a trip or do something different one day and explore a different neighborhood. Routine is very much part of most people's lives. So how do we handle the banality of routine and find the interesting in the everyday?
Yeah, thank you. I love your haiku story, and that is one really great example of how you can turn a routine into something more entertaining to experience, right? And how you can make that more valuable. I think there's all sorts of little things like this that we can do. I have my own thing that I do when I'm cooking dinners, which is often a struggle, certainly after a long day of work. And uh, often I have no plan, don't know what to make for dinner, and so I'll in my head play like I'm playing Iron Chef. I'll like pick out an ingredient and Iron Chef it, and simply even by getting into that mode where I'm like, oh, I'm Iron Chefing, that really adds a layer of interest to your routine. And on everyday, I think there's so many spaces on the everyday level to incorporate these little things that really do have a cumulative effect of enhancing our lives. We can wear something new, right? We can put something new on, go do a deep dive of your closet and find something that, you never wear for whatever reason, and then just put it on, see how it makes you feel, right? Notice that you're wearing it and you'll probably have some thoughts about it. I think we can, even little things, right? Like decide to write with a colored pencil or pen one day, right? Just that'll change your life. I mean, these little things, it will change your day, right? I mean, you'll notice it, right? It'll add something to your day. So I think that there are all kinds of moves, and bringing here we're talking a lot about bringing creativity to our day-to-day lives, which is something I think we're all capable of. And what creativity is just all about finding something new or doing, bringing together, doing something new. And so by bringing a little creativity to our day-to-day lives, even if it feels so tiny, they'll have a cumulative effect.
Yeah, and I think that's to go back to Aristotle. I mean, he very much says it's, your life kind of is the accumulation of these daily moments and habits. And, just as one swallow does not make a spring, like you've got to have lots and lots of moments and collect them and add to them, like a great tapestry rather than just here's the moment, I'm happy or not, and it's not like a finished product, so to speak. But I do love the detail to the small things and the small pleasures. Is there an element of Epicureanism in that? Perhaps like the idea of sitting down with your cup of coffee and appreciating it being like just the right temperature, or just that sort of detail to the small things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a lot of kind of recognizing what it is that we're getting, and even the little things that are just, fulfilling our basic needs like coffee, that we're better off if we sit there and pay attention to what we're doing and notice these things as opposed to worrying about something else. And so I think there are these great strategies where it does, certainly have themes that I think we find in many different areas of philosophy. But it does go back to this basic thing about living, in our present and noticing it and not spiraling out somewhere else, whether it's to an anxious place or just to a different place. But being in connection with what we're doing every day is going to be a form of engagement, and that's over time, as you said, right? That's going to build up.
It's one thing that I really love about the Japanese culture. And I should just say, I never learned Japanese. I mean, I studied it, but I just liked really doing the alphabet, like the actual vocabulary. I didn't really get. But one of the things I love about the Japanese culture is that, you have things that have ritualized these daily activities and make them beautiful and purposeful. So, like the tea ceremony, important, like all these little actions that maybe if you don't pay attention to them, there's some chore, you do them mindlessly. But to sort of artfully pour your tea is just a way to make meaning and beauty out of these everyday occurrences.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that example because look what we're doing. We're taking pouring tea and we are infusing it with value just by how we approach it and how we're thinking about it. And we can extend that to all areas of our life, right? To just look at what we're doing anyways, right? And pay some attention to it and try to do it with style, or try to look at your ordinary routines in a different frame of reference is going to help bring a lot of value to our lives.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna think, okay, next time I have to make the bed. I remember my grandma Jeannie used to tell me to make my bed.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Even the little things. Now, kind of a big question, step back a bit, because we're gonna getting into the details, but when you think about the goal of a good life, I mean, can it actually be accomplished or for very long? I mean, is it something that we can achieve, or is it just worth the effort to try?
Yeah, well, I would encourage us to think of the good life as a way of living and not necessarily like something that we're trying to achieve and just get because it's not going to last, right? And if we look in terms of that, if we take that mindset towards living a good life, I think we're prioritizing the end too much over this process. And so how I approach the good life is just striving for it and under striving for it in the day to day and to keep trying. So one of, as I'm thinking about the good life in terms of these three different areas, meaningfulness, happiness, and psychological richness, one of the nice thing about carving out our the good life in those ways is that we can really kind of think, right, where there are times when we're not feeling happy or we're not, or happiness just isn't possible for us in a moment. If we're in tune with what our good life looks like, then we can kind of seize on that and say, all right, well, maybe I'll do something interesting instead. And so I think that living a good life is much more so how we approach our day-to-day experiences. And of course, that doesn't mean we can't, sit back in moments and structure our lives in certain ways and think about how they'll be able to allow us to achieve or to have more happiness, have more vacations, things like that. So those kinds of reflections are important, but I think most important is on this ordinary level of thinking what am I getting out of my day and what is available to me in this moment. And so if we pay attention to, and here's where we can learn a lot from the research. So if we pay attention to the kind of things which happiness is correlated with, let's just take that example between happiness and psychological richness, right? So there's a lot of times where happiness is not available to us, where for whatever it is, we just can't get those positive feelings going. And so if we are able to recognize in the moments, right, where it is that we are, what it is that we are able to do and not able to do, then we'll be able to take those moments and say, okay, well, right now I can't really, I'm not really feeling great. Maybe something difficult is going on. Well, I can read a book and find something really interesting there, or I can take a drive and learn to notice things. So these things are available to us even when happiness is not. And that's part of the really cool thing of knowing that psychological richness is distinct from happiness and meaning. It overlaps with these things. Of course, many experiences will be happy and psychologically rich, but by being a distinct category, it means that we can have it even when we're not happy or even when we're not finding meaning in life. So we can have interesting experiences that involve difficult, painful emotions. And you know what? We can, so when we approach our lives, we don't have to say, oh, I'm in just such a bad place right now and just give up trying on thinking we can live a good life. We can say, all right, well, I need to take a different approach to it. I need to fill another bucket.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And I think that's more options for people at different times in their life. It's like having more quivers, the arrows in their quiver, like more options to paths to take to continue on in a meaningful and happy life, and that's like the goal, right? So, um, one last question. I just want to ask about sort of the concept of novelty, because we're talking about the opposite, the banality, boredom, so something new and interesting. Is there ever a risk that it can be shallow, that in some ways we live in a really specialized world, and to get a PhD or become a doctor or do, so many things, you have to have a sort of sustained focus, for better or for worse, for a lot of different jobs that exist in the world. So, um, does that focus kind of get derailed by trying to constantly bring in the new and the novel?
Yeah, and I think there's a way to have it all. And so I think that what we're doing when we are focusing in on a certain pursuit or trying to make a certain accomplishment, then certainly we have to narrow our attention on that in order to be successful on that. But I think if we do that all day, every day, we're really going to end up in an impoverished life. And so I want to encourage us to think that, just because we're involved with something that is very important to us and that we find meaning in and that we think is just objectively meaningful and important to do, that there's going to be other times available to us and other ways of using our mind. And I do worry a little bit about, certainly I feel like in the US, we get a lot of pressure to do those things, to strive, to narrow our attention and just focus on this end goal. And I do think that the more we do that, the more we impoverish our lives, because there's plenty of time for it all. And I don't think that anyone would say the success at, getting a PhD or, starting a charity or anything like that. I don't think anyone would say the success at that derives from doing that 24/7. And we all need breaks. We're going to burn out. Our minds just can't do that forever. And one really cool thing about the interesting is that it engages a different part of our mind, right? So the part of our mind that strives for meaning and achievement, right? I think about that. That's more the rational side of us, right? That can structure things and plan and evaluate. And the part of our mind that we use to engage the interesting just isn't that part. It can be unstructured. It um, can be absent of meaning, and yet it's still going to enhance our lives. And I think just recognizing that is important. And also, I think that too, we need to look at this over periods of time as well. There are certainly absolutely times in my life where I get very keyed into one thing and start to do that a lot. And I find that very important and meaningful for, a certain time. But I always hope, and I always do come out of it at a certain stage and say, okay, well, I need something else now. And for all of us, we're going to have our own inclinations towards more, perhaps there's those of us who need more meaning in life, or those of us who need more psychologically richness in life than others. But these are all important to all of us, but it's in different degrees. And I think that also follows for periods of your life. So there are some areas where, um, I remember recently there was an area I was involved in writing this book where I was very engaged, very focused on this. And also it was post-pandemic, so I was really focused on traveling and having these other kinds of experiences. And I just wasn't worried about happiness that much. And that was okay for me then. And later, move on to a different place where, yeah, no, I need to prioritize happiness more. So we can think about this both short term and long term, and I think either way, it's going to pay off to make room, to make space in our lives for these other important dimensions.
That's very well said. And I think, it's in over the years of discussing different types of philosophies and things, I think it's always important to sometimes study and understand these concepts before you need them, when you have them ready for you, because sometimes if you're stuck in a moment in your life, being motivated to then start doing something interesting might not occur to you as much. But if you kind of prepare your toolbox and have it ready for at any moment in your life when you need something, then okay, this is something I can do now. I'm going to get up and take fencing or something. I don't
Yep.
know, or just start
Yeah.
reading a completely new book. I'm going to try science fiction or some different genre, something that just awakens, something new in yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does pay. I'm a big advocate of learning about what makes life valuable so that you can go for it in these moments when you need it. And so absolutely, I agree with that.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time talking to me today. Speaking of interesting, I found your book, The Art of Interesting, interesting to read as well. You did a great job including stories and really great examples and stuff. So it was a really enjoyable book to get stuck into and to think about these things in a different way. And just the act of stepping back and thinking, okay, what does make happiness is so worthwhile in and of itself. So I want to thank you so much for talking about it and sort of bringing this concept to life.
Thank you so much. It's very rewarding to hear that. That's what I'm going for. And so thank you very much. And it was great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.